The main event that took place within the lands of Poland in the early Middle Ages, as well as other parts of Central Eastern Europe, was the arrival, and subsequent permanent settlement, of the Slavic peoples. The Slavic migrations in the area of contemporary Poland started in the second half of the 5th century CE. Some half-century after these territories were vacated by Germanic tribes, the previous inhabitants. The first waves of the incoming Slavs settled the vicinity of the upper Vistula River and elsewhere in the lands of present southeastern Poland and southern Masovia. Coming from the east, from the upper and middle regions of the Dnieper River, the immigrants would have had come primarily from the western branch of the early Slavs known as Sklavna, and since their arrival are classified as West Slavs. Their early archaeological traces belong to the Prague-Quartic culture, which is similar to the earlier Kiev culture. From there the new population dispersed north and west over the course of the 6th century. The Slavs lived from cultivation of crops and were generally farmers, but also engaged in hunting and gathering. The migrations took place when the destabilizing invasions of Eastern and Central Europe by waves of people and armies from the east, such as the Huns, Avars and Magyars, were occurring. This westward movement of Slavic people was facilitated in part by the previous emigration of Germanic peoples toward the safer and more developed areas of Western and Southern Europe. The immigrating Slavs formed various small tribal organizations beginning in the 8th century, some of which coalesced later into larger, state-like ones. Beginning in the 7th century, these tribal units built many fortified structures with earth and wood walls and embankments, called gords. Some of them were developed and inhabited, others had a very large empty area inside the walls. By the 9th century, the Slavs had settled the Baltic coast in Pomerania, which subsequently developed into a commercial and military power. Along the coastline, remnants of Scandinavian settlements and emporia were to be found. The most important of them was probably the trade settlement and seaport of Trousseau, located in Prussia. Prussia itself was relatively unaffected by Slavic migration and remained inhabited by Baltic Old Prussians. During the same time, the tribe of the Vistulans, based in Krakow and the surrounding region, controlled a large area in the south, which they developed and fortified with many strongholds. During the 10th century, the Polands turned out to be of decisive historic importance. Initially based in the central Polish lowlands around Giecz, Poznan and Gniezno, the Polands went through a period of accelerated building of fortified settlements and territorial expansion beginning in the first half of the 10th century. Under Moscow I of the Piast dynasty, the expanded Poland territory was converted to Christianity in 966, which is generally regarded the birth of the Polish state. The contemporary names of the realm, Moscow's or Gniezno state, were dropped soon afterwards in favor of Poland, a rendering of the Poland's tribal name. The Piast dynasty would continue to rule Poland until the late 14th century. Origin of the Slavic peoples. Slavic beginnings in Poland. The origins of the Slavic peoples, who arrived on Polish lands at the outset of the Middle Ages, archaeologically as the Prague culture, go back to the Kiev culture, which formed beginning early in 3rd century CE, and which is genetically derived from the post-Zarubintsy cultural horizon, and itself was one of the later post-Zarubintsy culture groups. Such ethno-genetic relationship is apparent between the large Kiev culture population and the early Slavic settlements in the Oder and Vistula basins, but lacking between these Slavic settlements and the older local cultures within the same region, that ceased to exist beginning in the 400–450 CE period. Zarubintsy culture. The Zarubintsy culture circle, in existence roughly from 200 BCE to 150 CE, extended along the middle and upper Dnieper and its tributary the Pripyat River, but also left traces of settlements in parts of Polsy and the upper Bug River basin. The main distinguished local groups were the Polsy group, the Middle Dnieper group and the Upper Dnieper group. The Zarubintsi culture developed from the Milorgrad culture in the northern part of its range and from the local Scythian populations in the more southern part. The Polsy group's origin was also influenced by the Pomeranian and Jastorf cultures. The Zarubintsi culture and its beginnings were moderately affected by Latin culture and the Black Sea area centers of civilization in the earlier stages, but not much by Roman influence later on, and accordingly its economic development was lagging behind that of other early Roman period cultures. Cremation of bodies was practiced, with the human remains and burial gifts including metal decorations, small in number and limited in variety, placed in pits. Kiev culture, originating from the post-Zarubintsi cultures and often considered the oldest Slavic culture. The Kiev culture functioned during the later Roman period north of the vast Chernyakhov culture territories, within the basins of the upper and middle Dnieper, Desna and Seam rivers. The archaeological cultural features of the Kiev sites show this culture to be identical or highly compatible with that of the 6th century Slavic societies, including the settlements on the lands of today's Poland. The Kiev culture is known mostly from settlement sites, the burial sites, involving pit graves, are few and poorly equipped. Not many metal objects have been found, despite the known native production of iron and processing of other metals, including enamel coating technology. Clay vessels were made without the potter's wheel. The Kiev culture represented an intermediate level of development, between that of the cultures of the Central European Barbaricum, and the forest-zoned societies of the eastern part of the continent. The Kiev culture consisted of 4 local formations: the Middle Dnieper group, the Desna group, the Upper Dnieper group and the Dnieper Don group. The general model of the Kiev culture is like that of the early Slavic cultures that were to follow and must have originated mainly from the Kiev groups, but evolved probably over a larger territory, stretching west to the base of the eastern Carpathian Mountains, and from a broader post-Zarubintsi foundation. The Kiev culture and related groups expanded considerably after 375 CE, when the Ostrogothic state, and more broadly speaking the Chernyakhov culture, were destroyed by the Huns. This process was facilitated further and gained pace, involving at that time the Kiev's descendant cultures, when the Hun Confederation itself broke down in the mid-5th century. Written sources: the eastern cradle of the Slavs is also directly confirmed by a written source. The anonymous author known as the cosmographer of Ravenna names Scythia, a geographic region encompassing vast areas of Eastern Europe, as the place where the generations of the Sklavna had their beginnings. Scythia, stretching far and spreading wide in the eastern and southern directions, had at the west end, as seen at the time of Jordan's writing or earlier, the Germans in the river Vistula. Jordanes places the Slavs in Scythia as well. Alternative point of view: according to an alternative theory, popular in the earlier 20th century and still represented today, the medieval cultures in the area of modern Poland are not a result of massive immigration, but emerged from a cultural transition of earlier indigenous populations, who then would need to be regarded as early Slavs. This view has mostly been discarded, primarily due to a period of archaeological discontinuity, during which settlements were absent or rare, and because of cultural incompatibility of the late ancient and early medieval sites. A 2011 article on the early Western Slavs states that the transitional period is difficult to evaluate archaeologically. Some believe that the late antique Germanic populations abandoned East Central Europe and were replaced by the Slavs coming from the east. Others see the Germanic groups as staying and becoming, or already being, Slavs. Current archaeology, says the author, is unable to give a satisfying answer, and probably both aspects played a role. In terms of their origin, territorial and linguistic, Germanic groups should not be played off against Slavs, as our current understanding of the terms may have limited relevance to the complex realities of the late antiquity and early Middle Ages. Local languages in the region cannot be identified by archaeological studies, and genetic evaluation of cremation burial remains has not been possible.